The sun over the Llano Verde territory did not just shine, it prosecuted. It beat down upon the earth with the heavy gavel of a judge who had long ago lost patience with the concept of mercy. It was late in the 1870s, a time when the West was bleeding out its old wildness to make room for the iron rails of progress. But out here, the land still held its breath. The red dust was not merely dirt. It was a second skin that coated every living thing, settling in the creases of men's faces and the deep cracks of the dry creek beds. Eleanor Hart stood by the split-rail fence that marked the southern perimeter of her property, the wire cutters heavy in her gloved hand. She was 30 years old, though the sun and the wind had etched a seriousness into her features that made her seem older, or perhaps just timeless. She was tall for a woman, with a frame that had shed all softness in exchange for the lean, roped muscle required to wrestle calves and drive fence posts. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back severely under a wide-brimmed hat, revealing a neck burned brown by the relentless exposure. She looked out over the herd. Her cattle were thinner than she liked, their ribs showing like the staves of a barrel against their dusty hides. But they were alive. They were alive because of the water. Hart Creek. It was the only reason she was still standing here, and it was the reason every man in Red Rock Crossing looked at her with a mix of desire and predation, while the other waterholes in the territory had turned to cracked mud and alkali dust. The spring on her land still bubbled up, cold and sweet, from deep within the limestone heart of the earth. It was a ribbon of life in a landscape of death. Eleanor wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve, leaving a streak of grime. It had been 2 years since William died. 2 years of silence in the ranch house. 2 years of sleeping with a Colt Navy revolver on the nightstand. 2 years of being the ice widow. The townspeople whispered the name when they thought she could not hear, and sometimes when they knew she could. They called her cold because she did not weep in the general store. They called her hard because she did not faint when the banker told her of the debts. They called her frozen because she refused to let any of them warm her bed. The memories of the suitors came to her unbidden as she twisted a loose wire back into place. First had been the deputy sheriff, a man with a mustache that drooped like a wet cat, who had come claiming he only wanted to ensure her safety. He had placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers lingering too long, suggesting that a woman alone was an unnatural thing in this country. She had removed his hand as one might remove a tick, and told him the only safety she required was a loaded cylinder. Then came the owner of the Gem Saloon, reeking of bay rum and stale beer, offering to buy the ranch so she could move back east to civilization. He had offered her $300. She knew the water rights alone were worth 10 times that. She had pointed the barrel of her rifle at his boots until he danced back to his buggy. She tightened the wire with a sharp grunt of effort. The physical pain was grounding. It was better than the other pain, the one she kept locked in a box at the back of her mind. William. The official report said Comanches. That was what everyone said when a man was found face down in the dirt with a hole in him out here. Indian raid, the coroner had scribbled, anxious to get back to his whiskey. But Eleanor remembered the body. She had washed him herself before the burial, despite the doctor telling her it was no job for a lady. She had seen the wound. It was a clean entry, small and precise. She had seen the arrows scattered around the wagon, too. They looked staged, stuck into the wood at odd angles, as if placed there by someone who had read about war parties in a dime novel but never seen one. But she said nothing. A widow's grief was expected to be hysterical, not analytical. The sound of hooves approaching broke her concentration. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She finished securing the splice in the wire, tested it with a gloved thumb, and then slowly pivoted, her hand drifting naturally to the holster on her hip. A black buggy was making its way up the long, dusty track from the main road. It was flanked by 2 riders, men who wore their guns low and their hats pulled low. In the buggy sat Silas Boone. Eleanor felt a coldness settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas Boone owned the Boone Cattle Company. He owned the bank. He owned the sheriff, or so people said. He was a man who collected things: land, money, souls. The buggy creaked to a halt 10 yards from where she stood. Boone stepped down, ignoring the dust that immediately attacked his polished boots. He was a man of 50, thick around the middle but solid, like a bull that had learned to walk on 2 legs. He wore a black frock coat despite the heat, and his face was smooth, shaved close, revealing a jawline that looked like it could crush stones. "Mrs. Hart," Boone said, tipping his hat. His voice was rich and deep, like molasses pouring over gravel. "A fine afternoon, though a mite warm for fence work." "Mr. Boone," Eleanor replied. She did not move toward him. She stood her ground, a solitary figure against the vast, empty horizon. "The fence does not mend itself, regardless of the weather." Boone chuckled, a dry sound. He walked to the fence, resting a hand on a post she had just checked. "You have a spirit, Eleanor. I have always admired that about you. William was a lucky man." "William is dead," she said flatly. "And my name is Mrs. Hart." Boone's smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky. "Of course, Mrs. Hart, I came to see if you had reconsidered my offer. The drought is not breaking. I saw 3 dead steers on the road just riding out here. Your neighbors are suffering." "My neighbors are welcome to water their stock at the creek, as they have been doing," Eleanor said. "I have never turned a thirsty animal away." "That is charity," Boone said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Charity does not pay the mortgage. Charity does not protect a lone woman out here on the edge of the territory." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The railroad is coming. Mrs. Hart. We both know it. The surveyors were seen north of the ridge last week. When those tracks come, this land will change. There will be noise, smoke, strangers, and money," Eleanor added, "which is why you want the deed." Boone sighed, the sound of a patient father dealing with a slow child. "I want to help you. You are holding on to a ghost. My dear, this ranch is too much work. Look at you. You are worn thin. A woman of your age should be in a parlor, with a needlepoint, not out here swallowing dust. I am offering you $5,000. That is a fortune. You could go to San Francisco. You could live like a queen." "I am not a queen," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "I am a rancher, and this is my land. It was William's land, and now it is mine. It is not for sale. Not for $5,000. Not for $50,000. Boone stared at her for a long moment. The mask of politeness slipped, just a fraction, revealing the wolf beneath. "You are stubborn. That is a dangerous quality in this country. You know the rumors. Mrs. Hart, the Comanches are moving again. Buffalo Hump's band has broken the reservation. They are angry. They are hungry. A ranch this far out, with water. It is a target." Eleanor felt the old, familiar anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden. "Is that a warning, Mr. Boone, or a threat?" "It is a reality," Boone said smoothly, stepping back to his buggy. "I would hate to see a tragedy repeat itself. The savages are ruthless. They do not care about property deeds or widows." He climbed back into the seat and picked up the reins. "Think about it. $5,000. And safety. That is more than most get in this life." He did not wait for an answer. He snapped the reins, and the buggy turned, the 2 riders trailing behind him like shadows. Eleanor watched them go until they were nothing but a cloud of red dust in the distance. Only then did she realize her hand was gripping the handle of her revolver so tightly her knuckles were white. She spat on the ground, the moisture sizzling on the baked earth. "Savages," she whispered, but the face she saw in her mind was not a Comanche. It was the smooth, pale face of Silas Boone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of labor. Eleanor moved through the chores with mechanical efficiency. She rode the perimeter, checking for breaks where the coyotes might slip through. She chopped wood for the stove, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm that matched her breathing. She milked the 2 dairy cows in the barn, the warm scent of milk and hay providing a brief respite from the harshness outside. But her mind was not on the work. It was in the town of Red Rock Crossing. She knew what they were saying in the barber shop and the mercantile. They said she was foolish. They said she was hoarding the water. They said it was only a matter of time before she was killed or ruined. The pressure was like the heat, invisible, omnipresent, and suffocating. Boone was right about one thing: the Comanches were the boogeymen of the territory. Every missing calf, every mysterious fire, every death was laid at their feet. It was a convenient fear. It kept the people huddled together, looking to men like Boone for protection. It made them willing to trade freedom for safety. But Eleanor could not shake the memory of the arrows around William's wagon. They had been Sioux arrows. She was sure of it, or at least styled that way. But the Sioux were 1,000 miles north. Comanches used different fletching. She had read about it in one of William's books. It was a small detail, a tiny grain of sand in the machinery of the accepted truth. But it grated on her. Dusk began to fall, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange. The temperature dropped, but the air remained dry. Eleanor finished her supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and sat on the porch of the ranch house. The structure was sturdy, built of logs and adobe, designed to withstand wind and arrows alike. She cleaned her rifle, a Winchester repeating carbine, the oil rag sliding smoothly over the metal. This was her evening ritual. Some women brushed their hair. Eleanor Hart brushed the actions of her firearms. The silence of the prairie was profound. Usually, the coyotes would be singing by now, or the nightjars calling. But tonight, the land was quiet, too quiet. It was the silence of a held breath. She stood up, the rifle in the crook of her arm, and walked out past the barn toward the creek. She needed to check the flow one last time before bed. The water was her lifeblood. She tended to it as a mother tends a child. The creek bubbled softly, the sound amplified in the stillness. The water reflected the first few stars that were piercing the darkening sky. Eleanor knelt, cupping her hand to drink. The water was icy cold, shocking her system, washing away the dust of the day. As she stood up, wiping her mouth, a sensation crawled up the back of her neck. It was a primal instinct, older than civilization, older than language, the feeling of being watched. Eleanor did not panic. She did not gasp. She slowly shifted the Winchester, bringing the stock up to her shoulder, her thumb silently pulling back the hammer. She scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing. To the west, a ridge of limestone rose up like the spine of a buried dragon against the dying light. It was perhaps 400 yards away, a dark silhouette against the deep indigo of the sky. And there, atop the ridge, something broke the line of the rock. It was a horse and a rider. Eleanor froze. It was too far to see details, but the outline was unmistakable. The horse was small, wiry, standing perfectly still. The rider sat tall, merging with the animal as if they were one creature. There was no cowboy hat, no saddle horn that she could discern. Instead, she saw the flutter of something long hair, perhaps, or feathers caught in the wind. And rising from the rider's hand was a thin, vertical line, a lance. The air left Eleanor's lungs. It was not a bandit. It was not one of Boone's hired guns. It was the thing the town whispered about, the shadow that haunted the edges of their maps. A Comanche. He was looking down at the ranch, looking down at the water, looking down at her. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. The distance between them was vast, yet she felt exposed, as if he were standing right in front of her. She tightened her finger on the trigger, waiting for the movement, the charge, the war cry. But the rider did not move. He simply sat there, a sentinel of the old world looking down on the encroaching new one. He was silent, still, and terrifyingly real. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned the horse. In a single fluid motion, the silhouette vanished behind the ridge, swallowed by the earth and the night. Eleanor stood alone by the creek, the rifle still raised, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence rushed back in, but it was no longer empty. It was heavy with presence. Boone had used the Comanche as a threat, a ghost story to scare a widow out of her land. But Eleanor knew now, with a certainty that chilled her blood, that the ghost was flesh and blood. She lowered the rifle slowly, her eyes not leaving the spot where the rider had been. She was not going to sleep tonight. She turned and walked back to the house, her boots crunching loudly on the gravel. She bolted the heavy oak door and slid the bar into place. Then she went to the window, peering out through the shutters into the darkness. The war for Hart Creek had been a cold one, fought with words and banknotes. But as Eleanor watched the shadows lengthen across her land, she knew that the heat was coming. The rider on the ridge was a spark, and the Llano Verde was a keg of powder waiting to blow. She checked the load in her revolver one more time, placed it on the table, and sat down to wait for the dawn. The dust from the buggy wheels of Silas Boone had barely settled before the chaos erupted in Red Rock Crossing. It began as a rumor carried on the wind, then a shout from the sentry on the church tower, and finally, a wagon careening into the main street with one wheel wobbling dangerously on a bent axle. The driver was a young man, barely 20, his face a mask of dried blood and white terror. He hauled back on the reins, the horses screaming as they fought the bit, foam flying from their mouths. "They killed them," the boy screamed, tumbling from the seat into the dirt. "They killed them all. The payroll is gone." Eleanor Hart was stepping out of the mercantile, a sack of flour heavy in her arms. She stopped, her eyes narrowing against the glare. A crowd formed instantly, pouring out of the saloon and the barber shop like water from a broken dam. Silas Boone was among the first to reach the wagon. He grabbed the boy by the collar of his shirt, hauling him up. "Who, boy, speak up," Boone's voice boomed, authoritative and theatrical. "Comanches," the boy sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the northern ridges. "Painted devils, hundreds of them. They shot Mr. Henderson. They took the strong box." A ripple of fear went through the crowd, palpable and electric. Eleanor walked closer, ignoring the murmurs of the men who stepped aside to let her pass. She looked at the wagon. There were arrows stuck in the wood, feathered with turkey quills. She looked at the blood on the seat. It was dry and dark. Boone released the boy and turned to the crowd, his face flushed with righteous indignation. "You see," he shouted, sweeping his arm toward the horizon. "I warned you, the savages are upon us. They do not want peace. They want our scalps and our money. This is an act of war." The men shouted their agreement, hands going to the pistols at their waists. But Eleanor moved to the side of the wagon and looked closely at the arrows. The angle was wrong. An arrow shot from horseback during a raid would strike downward or level. These were driven upward, as if someone standing on the ground had hammered them in. She said nothing. She adjusted her grip on the flour sack and walked toward her horse. But as she passed Boone, his eyes flickered toward her, cold and knowing. He knew she saw, and he did not care. 2 days later, the fear in the territory had curdled into a sour, aggressive panic. Every shadow was a Comanche. Every coyote howl was a war cry. Boone used this fear like a master craftsman uses a chisel. He rode out to Hart Creek alone this time. Eleanor was cleaning the trough near the barn. Her sleeves rolled up, revealing arms that were strong and scarred from barbed wire. She did not stop scrubbing when he dismounted. 3 ranches burned in the valley. "Eleanor," Boone said, not bothering with pleasantries. He stood by the gate, his black coat absorbing the heat. "The Miller family fled last night. They left everything." "The Millers are cowards who never knew how to dig a well," Eleanor said, scrubbing a patch of algae. "They left because they were thirsty. Silas, not because they were scared." "You are a stubborn woman," Boone said, stepping into the corral. "But stubbornness is not a shield against a bullet. The town is forming a militia. I am leading it. We are going to sweep the valley." "Good luck to you," she said without looking up. "I cannot protect you out here." "Eleanor," Boone said, his voice dropping to that silky, dangerous register. "Not unless you are part of my household. Not unless this land is under the protection of the Boone Cattle Company." Eleanor dropped the brush into the water. She straightened up, wiping her wet hands on her apron. She turned to face him. Is that what this is? You scare the territory half to death so you can buy land for pennies on the dollar, or do you just want to add me to your collection of assets? I am offering you survival, Boone snapped, his patience fraying. You are a woman alone, a widow. It is unnatural. It is dangerous. Sell to me, Eleanor, or marry me. I do not care which. But you will not stay here alone. I will not allow it. You will not allow it, Eleanor repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the spring water. The bank holds the note in the feed store. I have friends in the territorial court. I can declare you incompetent. I can declare this land a hazard to public safety if the Indians are using your water. He took a step toward her, reaching for her arm. Eleanor moved faster than he expected. Her hand flashed to her hip. The Colt Navy appeared as if by magic, the heavy barrel leveled at his chest. Boone froze. He looked at the gun, then at her face. There was no shaking in her hand. Her eyes were empty of fear, empty of hesitation. Get off my land, Silas, she said. If you touch me, I will put a hole in your black coat that no tailor can fix. Boone stared at her, his jaw working. For a moment, she thought he might lunge, but he saw the white tension in her knuckle on the trigger. He raised his hands slowly, a mock gesture of surrender. You are making a mistake, Mrs. Hart, he hissed. A grave mistake. When the savages come for you, do not scream for me. I would rather scream for the devil, she replied. He backed away, mounted his horse, and rode hard toward the gate. Eleanor watched him go, then holstered the gun. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to hold her up. She was trembling, not from fear of Boone, but from the realization that the war had officially begun. 5 miles to the west, in the broken country where the limestone canyons twisted like snakes, a man was running. He was young, perhaps 24 years old. His name was Tahan. He ran with a loping, rhythmic stride that ate up the miles, but his breath was coming in ragged gasps. He was bleeding. A bullet had grazed his upper arm, tearing through the muscle, and another had clipped his ribs. Behind him, the sound of shod hooves on stone echoed off the canyon walls. The bounty hunters, men hired by Boone, men who did not care about guilt or innocence, only the weight of the silver in their pockets. Tahan stopped for a moment, pressing his hand against the sandstone wall. He was a Comanche, a lord of the plains. His people had ruled this land before the Spanish, before the Texans, before the railroad. But now he was a wolf with his leg in a trap. He had not robbed the payroll wagon. He had been tracking the men who did white men who wore moccasins to leave false trails. But when Boone's men found him near the site, they had opened fire without asking questions. He checked his quiver. 2 arrows left. His rifle was empty, lost in the scramble up the scree slope. He needed a horse. He needed distance. And he needed water. He looked toward the east, toward the smoke rising from the town of Red Rock Crossing. It was madness to go there. It was suicide, but the hunters were cutting off the escape route to the plains. The town was the last place they would expect him to go. He closed his eyes for a second, summoning the strength of his ancestors. Then he began to move again, cutting toward the road. It was high noon when the dust cloud appeared at the end of Main Street. The town was busy, the saloon was full, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out like a bell. Eleanor was standing on the boardwalk outside the bank. She had just withdrawn $50, her emergency fund, defying Boone's glare from behind the teller's cage. She had her hand on her hip, near her gun, feeling the weight of the hostile stares from the townspeople. They blamed her, in a way. Her refusal to sell, her refusal to be afraid, made them feel small. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer stopped. Then the conversation on the porch of the general store died. Silence swept down the street like a cold wind. Eleanor turned to look. A single horse walked down the center of the street. It was a stolen animal, a branded bay mare, frothing with exhaustion. On its back sat Tahan. He was a striking, terrifying figure. His long black hair was loose, matted with dust and sweat. He wore leggings of buckskin and a vest of beads, but his chest was bare and streaked with blood. He held a lance in one hand, the tip pointing to the sky, and he rode with a dignity that made the town's structures seem cheap and temporary. He did not look at the men who came spilling out of the saloon with shotguns. He did not look at the deputy sheriff who was fumbling with his holster. He rode straight down the middle of the street, heading nowhere, yet heading everywhere. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. She should have been afraid. She should have hated him. He was the enemy. He was the monster who had supposedly killed her husband. Tahan pulled the horse to a halt in the dust, directly in front of the bank. He swayed slightly, the loss of blood taking its toll. Then, he turned his head. He looked past the deputy. He looked past Boone, who had emerged onto the steps of the bank. He looked straight at Eleanor. The world seemed to narrow down to a tunnel between her blue eyes and his obsidian dark ones. It was a look that stripped her bare. There was no pleading in it, no arrogance, and no lust. It was a look of absolute, crushing recognition. He saw the grief she carried like a stone in her chest. He saw the loneliness that was colder than the winter wind. He saw the iron will that kept her standing when she should have fallen. And she saw him. Not a savage, not a killer, but a man who was dying on his feet because he refused to kneel. Something inside Eleanor's heart shattered. It was the sound of ice cracking on a frozen river. The walls she had built for 2 years, the indifference, the hardness, the ice widow persona crumbled into dust. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a painful, frantic rhythm. She felt dizzy, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion that she could not name. It was as if he had reached across the distance and touched her soul with a hot iron. "Murderer!" Silas Boone's scream broke the spell. Boone stood on the steps, pointing a finger at Tahan. "That is him. That is the savage who robbed the wagon. That is the killer. Look at the blood on him. It is the blood of honest men." The mob roared. It was a hungry, ugly sound. "String him up!" someone shouted. "Get a rope!" Tahan did not flinch. He looked away from Eleanor and addressed the crowd. His voice was rough, the English clipped and heavily accented, but it carried over the noise. "Not my people," he said. He held up his arm, showing the fresh wound. "This blood is mine, not your money, not dead." "Liar," Boone bellowed. "Deputy, do your duty, arrest him, or better yet, save the county the cost of a trial." The deputy, a man named Miller, who owed Boone money, stepped forward, cocking his shotgun. "Get down, boy, or I will blow you down." Tahan gripped his lance. He was ready to die. He would take 2 or 3 of them with him. His muscles coiled. "Stop!" The voice was sharp, clear, and feminine. It cut through the testosterone and the dust like a whip crack. Eleanor stepped off the boardwalk. She walked into the street, placing herself directly between the deputy's shotgun and the Comanche's horse. The silence that followed was absolute. The ice widow, the woman who hated everyone, was shielding a Comanche. "Mrs. Hart, move aside," the deputy stammered, lowering the barrel slightly. "He is a killer. He is a man standing on my property." Eleanor lied. Her voice was steady, though her knees were shaking. She pointed to the survey marker at the edge of the street, near the bank's corner. "My deed extends to the center line of this road. Deputy, you know that. And on my land. Nobody gets hanged without a judge." "He is an Indian." "Eleanor," Boone shouted, his face turning purple. "He has no right. Step away." Eleanor turned to face Boone, her back to Tahan. She could smell the horse, the sweat, and the metallic tang of blood from the man behind her. "If you want him, Silas, you go through me, shoot me. Go ahead, shoot a white woman in the middle of Main Street. See how the governor likes that when the railroad investors hear about it." It was a gamble, a desperate, insane gamble. But she knew Boone. He was greedy, and he was cruel. But he was a businessman first. Killing a white woman in broad daylight would bring the cavalry and federal marshals, ruining his plans for a quiet land grab. Boone stared at her, hatred radiating from him in waves. He looked at the crowd. The men were confused. They wanted blood, but they couldn't shoot a woman. The momentum of the lynch mob faltered. "You are insane," Boone spat. "You are a traitor to your race." "I am a citizen protecting the law," Eleanor said. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Behind her, she heard Tahan shift. He was smart. He saw the opening. "Go," she whispered, barely moving her lips. Tahan did not hesitate. He kicked the mare's flanks. The horse surged forward, not away from the town, but cutting sharply down the alley between the bank and the livery stable, heading toward the open scrubland to the south. "Get him," Boone screamed. "Shoot him!" Gunshots erupted. Dust kicked up where the horse had been. Men scrambled for their horses, shouting orders. Eleanor stood in the dust, the smell of gunpowder stinging her nose. She did not move until the last rider had galloped past her. Then she looked up at Boone, who was still standing on the steps, breathing hard. "You have chosen your side, widow," he said softly. "God help you." Eleanor did not answer. She turned and walked to her own wagon. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely untie the reins. She had to go home. She had to go to Hart Creek, because she knew exactly where the Comanche was going. The sun was setting by the time she reached the ranch. The ride had been a blur of paranoia, her eyes scanning every ridge for Boone's men. But the hunters had ridden north, assuming the Indian would try to circle back to the reservation. Eleanor knew better. He was hurt. He needed water. And the only water for 20 miles was Hart Creek. She left her wagon by the house and grabbed her Winchester. She moved silently through the tall grass toward the dense thicket of willows that lined the creek bed. The birds were quiet. The crickets were silent. He was here. She found him collapsed near the water's edge, half hidden by the root system of an ancient cottonwood tree. The bay mare was standing nearby, drinking greedily. Tahan was lying on his side. He had tried to wash the wound, but he had lost too much blood. He was conscious, his eyes tracking her as she approached. He had a knife in his hand, his knuckles white. Eleanor stopped 10 feet away. She raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at his chest. This was the moment. This was the vengeance she had been promised. The man before her represented everything she hated: the fear, the loss of William, the chaotic violence of the frontier. If she pulled the trigger, she could drag his body to town. Boone would have to pay the reward. The town would call her a hero. She would be safe. "Do it," Tahan rasped. His voice was weak, but his eyes were the same burning coals that had pierced her in town. "Finish it." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the blood soaking the earth. She remembered the staged arrows in the wagon. She remembered the fear in the boy's eyes. She remembered Boone's polished boots and his threats. And she remembered the look, the connection, the sudden, terrifying realization that she was not dead inside. She slowly lowered the hammer of the rifle. "No," she said. She stepped closer. Tahan tensed, raising the knife. "Put it down," she ordered, her tone shifting from rancher to nurse. "If I wanted you dead, you would be dead. You are bleeding out on my clean soil." Tahan hesitated. Then his hand dropped. The knife fell into the dirt. "Can you walk?" she asked. He nodded once, gritting his teeth. "Get up," Eleanor said. "The barn is dry. And if you die in there, at least the coyotes will not get you." She moved to his side, sliding her arm under his good shoulder. He had heavy, solid muscle and bone, and his skin burned with fever. As he leaned his weight against her, the smell of him, sage, horse, and iron filled her senses. It was a foreign, dangerous scent, but it was also undeniably human. She half dragged, half walked him toward the old barn at the back of the property, the one she never used. As they crossed the threshold into the shadows, Eleanor Hart knew she had just committed treason. She had just declared war on her own people, but for the first time in 2 years, as she felt the beat of another human heart against her own. She did not feel cold. The first 3 days in the old barn were a study in silence and negotiated survival. Eleanor Hart did not sleep in her bed. She slept in a chair by the kitchen window, her rifle across her lap, watching the barn door where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink. She had stripped Tahan of his weapons immediately. The lance, the knife, the bow she had locked them in the main house, in the heavy oak chest that had once held William's Sunday suits. Tahan had not resisted. He had leaned against the manger, his face gray with pain, and watched her with eyes that were uncomfortably intelligent. When she told him she would have to tie his hands when she was not present, he had simply held out his wrists. "It is a waste of rope," he had said, his voice rough like scraping stone. "If I wanted to kill you, woman, I would have done it in the street. I am not afraid of you killing me," Eleanor had replied, tightening the hemp knot against the wooden post, leaving him enough slack to sit or lie down, but not to roam. "I am afraid of you running before you are healed and bringing the sheriff back to my doorstep to collect a corpse." He had looked at her then, a flicker of amusement in the dark depth of his gaze. "You think you own my death, too like the water. I own everything on this land," she had said, turning her back on him, including the trouble. The tending of his wounds became a ritual that frayed her nerves more than any gunfight. On the second afternoon, the heat in the barn was stifling. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gaps in the roof. Eleanor brought a basin of hot water, clean rags, and a jar of salve she made herself from arnica and tallow. "Sit up," she commanded. Tahan pushed himself up from the straw. He was naked from the waist up, his buckskin shirt ruined by blood and the physician's shears she had used earlier. His skin was the color of bronze that had been left in the fire, dark and smooth over hard, roped muscle. She dipped the rag in the water. She had to lean close to reach the bullet graze on his shoulder and the deeper gouge along his ribs. As she worked, washing away the dried blood, she was acutely aware of the heat radiating from him. He burned with a vitality that was startling compared to the dry, dusty world outside. Her fingers brushed against his skin. It was hot, firm, and mapped with the history of his life. She saw a jagged white line across his pectoral muscle, a knife scar. She saw the round, puckered mark of an old arrow wound on his forearm. "This will sting," she murmured, uncorking the salve. He did not flinch as she applied the pungent ointment. He sat as still as a carved statue, his breathing slow and deep. Eleanor could smell him the scent of wood smoke, old leather, horse, and the salt of his skin. It was an earthy, masculine smell, devoid of the bay rum and tobacco that clung to men like Silas Boone. She wrapped the clean linen around his torso. To do so, she had to lean over him, her arms encircling his chest for a brief moment. Her cheek was inches from his bare shoulder. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart against her forearm. For a second, the air in the barn seemed to vanish. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Eleanor froze. She found herself looking at the strong column of his throat, the way the black hair fell against his neck. A sudden, treacherous thought spiked through her mind, a desire to rest her head there, to feel that warmth, to stop being the woman of iron and ice for just 1 minute. Tahan turned his head. His eyes caught hers. They were not predator's eyes now. They were wide, dark pools that reflected her own startled expression. He did not move away. He did not speak. He just looked at her. And in that look, there was a question that had no words. Eleanor jerked back as if she had touched a hot stove. She stumbled slightly, knocking the water basin. It clattered loudly against the wooden floor, splashing water onto her boots. "Fool!" she hissed under her breath. Grabbing the basin, she did not know if she was speaking to him or herself. "Stay still. Do not pull the stitches." She gathered her supplies and marched out of the barn, her heart hammering a rhythm of panic and shame against her ribs. She was a widow. She was 30 years old. She was not a schoolgirl to be flustered by a savage with broad shoulders. But that night, as she watched the barn from her window, she touched her own wrist where it had brushed his skin. The memory of the heat would not fade. Trust came slower than healing, but it came. It arrived not with promises, but with information. 3 days later, Tahan was strong enough to sit on an upturned crate while she mended a bridle. He watched her hands work the leather. "The wagon," he said suddenly. "The money wagon. It was not us. Eleanor did not look up, but her hands paused. The whole town says it was. Turkey feathers on the arrows. Scalping knives. White men play dress-up, Tahan said with a sneer. They wear moccasins with hard soles. They use feathers from birds they shoot for sport, not prayer. We were tracking them. They hit a Comanche hunting party 2 moons ago. Took horses, take women. Eleanor looked at him then. You were hunting them. Vengeance, Tahan corrected. They are led by a man with a scar on his lip. I saw him. I saw him meet with the man in the black coat. Eleanor felt a chill slide down her spine. The man in the black coat. Big man, rides a black horse, smells like money. Boone, Eleanor whispered. They met at the Standing Rock. Tahan continued. I was close. The black coat gave the scar man a bag. Heavy. Gold sounds different from silver when it hits the hand. And he gave him a paper. A map. Eleanor set the bridle down. Her mind was racing, fitting jagged pieces of glass into a terrible mosaic. A map of what? The wagon route, Tahan said. And other places, ranches. Eleanor stood up and walked to the barn door, looking out at the shimmering heat of the valley. 2 years ago, she said, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. My husband, William, he was driving the buckboard from the railhead. They said it was a war party. They said he was filled with arrows. Did they take the horses? Tahan asked. No. They shot the horses. Comanche do not shoot horses unless we have to, Tahan said simply. Horses are life. White bandits shoot horses because they are too heavy to steal. Eleanor closed her eyes. The memory of William's body on the undertaker's table flashed before her. The wounds, the small, neat holes. The bullets, she said softly. The doctor dug one out. He said it was a .50 caliber, Springfield. Soldier gun, Tahan said. Or bandit guns, not Comanche. We use Winchesters if we have them. Or bows. The rage that rose in her was not the hot flash she had felt toward Boone before. It was cold. It was a glacier moving inside her chest, crushing everything in its path. She had hated the faceless shape of the Indian for 2 years. She had directed all her grief, all her bitterness toward men like Tahan, and all the while, the man who had ordered her husband's death had been standing on her porch, offering her charity, trying to buy the land William had died for. She turned back to Tahan. Why tell me this? You know I could still turn you in? You have the eyes of a person who values truth, Tahan said, even if the truth is ugly. And because you saved me, a Comanche pays his debts. The drought tightened its grip on the Llano Verde. The sky was a relentless, bleached blue, devoid of clouds. The wind was a hairdryer blowing dust into every crevice of the house. Other ranches were failing. Eleanor saw the dust plumes of cattle drives heading north, desperate men moving their herds to the Pecos River, abandoning their dried-out claims. Silas Boone was buying them up, one by one. His empire was growing, surrounding Heart Creek like a tightening noose. Tahan began to work. It was not something they discussed. It just happened. Eleanor was struggling to repair a section of the corral that a spooked steer had smashed. She was trying to lift a heavy cedar post, gritting her teeth against the strain, when hands appeared next to hers. Let me, he said. He was still stiff, moving with a slight hitch to protect his ribs, but his strength was returning. He lifted the post with a grunt and slotted it into the hole. They worked together in the mornings and evenings, avoiding the midday sun. He showed her how to weave the willow branches into the fence gaps to save wire. He showed her how to listen to the ground, to know where the wild horses were moving. One evening, a Mustang colt, separated from its herd, wandered near the creek. It was wild, eyes rolling, kicking at the air if Eleanor got within 50 feet. Tahan walked out to it. He did not have a rope. He did not have a whip. He walked slowly, his body loose, making a low, rhythmic sound in his throat. It was not a song, exactly, but a vibration. Eleanor watched from the porch, mesmerized. The colt stopped kicking. It stood shivering, watching the man approach. Tahan stopped 5 feet away. He extended a hand, palm down. He breathed out, a long, audible exhalation. The colt mimicked him, blowing air through its nostrils. Tahan moved in. His hand touched the colt's withers. The animal shuddered, then leaned into his touch. "How did you do that?" Eleanor asked later, as they sat on the steps of the bunkhouse, sharing a canteen of water. "You fight the animal," Tahan said, gesturing to the corral where she broke her horses. "You try to break its spirit to fit your will. I ask the animal to lend me its strength. I promise I will not waste it." "It is a horse," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "It is a tool." "It is a brother," Tahan corrected. "Everything that lives on the grass is a brother. The wolf, the hawk, even the white woman who builds fences to keep the world out." Eleanor looked at him sharply, but there was no mockery in his face. "I build fences to keep what is mine safe." "Nothing is safe," Tahan said, looking at the stars that were beginning to prick the twilight. "The land does not belong to you. Eleanor, you belong to the land. You die, the land stays, the fence rots, the wind blows it all away." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue, the vowels slightly elongated, softer than anyone else had ever spoken it. The break in the weather came a week later, not with a gentle shower, but with a violent, atmospheric tantrum. The sky turned a bruised purple, and thunder rolled across the plains like artillery fire. When the rain started, it fell in sheets, hard and cold. Eleanor and Tahan were caught near the barn, securing the shutters. They ducked inside just as the heavens opened up, drenching the world in a deafening roar. They sat on the hay bales, watching the water curtain the open door. The air cooled instantly, smelling of wet earth and ozone. The oil lantern cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. "The rain is good," Tahan said. "The grass will sing tomorrow." "It will just wash the topsoil away if it keeps up like this," Eleanor said, hugging her knees. The drop in temperature made her shiver. Tahan noticed. He picked up a horse blanket from the rail and offered it to her. "Take it. I am fine. Take it," he insisted. "You are shivering." She took the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a long time, the storm raging outside, creating a strange, intimate cocoon. "My wife," Tahan said suddenly. "She loved the rain. She would stand in it until her hair was heavy with water." Eleanor turned to him, surprised. "You were married?" "Was," Tahan said. His face was unreadable in the shadows. "Soldiers came to our winter camp 3 years ago. They did not look for warriors. They shot into the tents. She was sewing, a bullet. It does not care who it hits." "I am sorry," Eleanor said. The words felt inadequate, tiny against the magnitude of his loss. "I carried her to the river," Tahan said, his voice distant. "I washed her hair, then I buried her. Then I stopped being a husband and became a warrior. I swore I would drive every blue coat and every settler from this land." He turned to look at her, his eyes intense. "I hated you before I saw you. You were just another fence builder." "And now?" Eleanor asked, her breath catching. "Now I see you are just like me," he said. "You are alone in a world that wants to eat you. You carry a ghost on your back." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, hot and sudden. She had not cried for William in months. "I never saw him die," she whispered. "I just saw the body. I never got to say goodbye. I kept the ranch because it was the only thing left of him. But sometimes I hate this place. I hate the dust. I hate the silence. I feel like I am guarding a graveyard." "Then why do you stay?" "Because I do not know how to be anything else," she confessed. "If I leave, I am just a widow. Here, I am the owner of Heart Creek. I am someone." Tahan reached out, his hand, rough and warm, covered hers where it rested on her knee. He did not pull away this time, and neither did she. "You are strong, Eleanor," he said. "Stronger than the men in that town. They fear you. That is why they want to break you." The touch of his hand was grounding. It was real. For the first time, the anger and the grief that had defined her existence for 2 years seemed to loosen their grip. She looked at his hand, dark against her pale skin, and realized that the lines drawn on maps meant nothing in this barn. The trouble began the next morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the world scoured clean. Eleanor rode out to check the mail drop at the edge of the property. She found the deputy sheriff, Miller, sitting on his horse near her gate, smoking a cigarette. "Morning, Mrs. Hart," Miller said, his eyes scanning her face, then drifting toward the house in the distance. "Deputy." Eleanor nodded, keeping her horse moving. "You have been locking this gate lately," Miller noted. "Padlock and chain. Never used to do that. There are bandits about, aren't there?" Eleanor said sharply. "Or Comanches. Or so Mr. Boone tells me." "Yeah," Miller drawled. "Funny thing, old man McGregor, down the road he says he saw a light in your barn 2 nights ago. Late. Says he saw 2 shadows. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained granite. "Mr. McGregor is half blind and drinks moonshine for breakfast. If he saw shadows, it was likely his own demons." Miller chuckled, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "Maybe, but folks are talking. Eleanor, they are wondering why you have not come to town for supplies. They are wondering if maybe you are under duress." "I am fine. Deputy, tell the town to mind its own business." "I will tell them," Miller said, turning his horse. "But Boone is organizing a search party. For the Indian. They are going to check every ranch, barn to cellar, just for safety. You understand." He rode off, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. When Eleanor returned to the ranch, she found Tahan packing a small leather pouch with dried meat. He had his shirt on, and he had found a sturdy piece of hickory to use as a temporary bow. "I have to go," he said without turning around. "You heard?" Eleanor asked. "I saw the dust. I saw the man with the badge. I cannot stay here. If they find me, they burn your house. They hang you for aiding an enemy." "You are not healed," Eleanor said. "The ribs are still knitting. You cannot ride hard." "I can ride," Tahan said, turning to face her. "I will go to the high country, lead them away." "No," Eleanor said. The word came out louder than she intended. Tahan paused. "Eleanor, do not be foolish. I am a danger to you." "I need help," she lied, desperate to find a reason that sounded practical. The steers are scattered after the storm. The fence in the north pasture is down. I cannot do it alone. If I lose those steers, I lose the ranch anyway." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. She did not want him to go. Not because of the steers. Not because of the ranch. She did not want him to go because the house would be silent again, because she would be alone with the ghost of William and the predatory shadow of Boone. Tahan looked at her for a long moment. He saw the fear she was trying to hide behind her pragmatic mask. He dropped the pouch onto the table. 2 days, he said. "We fix the fence. Then I go." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. The end of the week brought reality crashing down. Eleanor and Tahan were riding the northern ridge, hidden by the scrub oak, checking for the stray cattle. Tahan suddenly pulled his horse back, signaling for silence. He pointed down into the valley, toward the eastern edge of Eleanor's land, the part that bordered the open range. Below them, a group of men had set up a temporary camp. There were tents, horses, and a wagon filled with strange equipment. Eleanor pulled her spyglass from her saddlebag and extended it. She saw men with tripods and brass instruments, surveyors' theodolites. They were driving wooden stakes into the ground, marking a line that cut straight across the creek, straight through her best pasture, and standing in the center of the group, looking at a large unfold map spread on a table, was Silas Boone. Beside him was a man in a military uniform, and another man in a suit, a railroad agent. Eleanor lowered the glass, her hand trembling with rage. "They are not asking anymore," she said, her voice cold steel. "They are measuring." "Iron Road," Tahan said, his face grim. "The snake that eats the land. They are on my property," Eleanor said. "That is trespassing." They do not care about your paper. Tahan said, "Look." He pointed to the perimeter of the camp. There were armed men patrolling. Not just cowboys, but men with rifles that looked new. Men who moved with the discipline of soldiers or mercenaries. "That is an army," Tahan said. "They are preparing for war." Eleanor looked at the stakes driving into the red earth of her home. She looked at Boone, laughing at something the railroad man said. And then she looked at Tahan, the Comanche warrior sitting beside her, the only person in the world she trusted. "Then let us give them a war," she said. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. The time for hiding in the barn was over. The inciting incident had passed. The rising action was cresting. The battle for Heart Creek had officially begun. The survey stakes were the first act of violence. The visit from Silas Boone the next day was the second. He did not come with a buggy this time. He rode a large black stallion, flanked by 4 men who wore deputies' badges but carried themselves like hired guns. Eleanor met him on the porch. She had Tahan hidden in the loft of the barn with a clear line of sight, but she prayed it would not come to shooting. Not yet. "Get down, Silas," she said, her hand resting on the smooth wood of the porch railing, deceptively relaxed. "Or state your business from the saddle and leave. My cattle get skittish around predators." Boone laughed, a sound devoid of humor. He dismounted, dusting off his pristine coat. "Always the sharp tongue. Eleanor, it is a defense mechanism. I know, but we are past the time for banter." He walked up the steps, stopping one stair below her so their eyes were level. "This is the last time I ask. Eleanor, sell the ranch. Or marry me. I can protect you. I can make the debts disappear. I can make the surveyors disappear. But if you persist in this stubbornness..." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "This is a notice from the territorial court. Unpaid taxes. Questionable title due to the original survey errors. And a citation for harboring a public nuisance." "A nuisance?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "The Indian," Boone hissed, his voice dropping. "Do not think I do not know. Eleanor, you shielded him in town. People talk. They say you are keeping him, a white woman and a savage. It is perverse. The court will seize this land for moral turpitude, if nothing else." Eleanor felt a cold rage settle in her chest, solid and heavy like a stone. "You speak of morality. Silas, you, who hire men to burn ranches, you, who meet with bandits in the dark." Boone's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. Then the mask slammed back down, harder than before. "You have a vivid imagination. My dear, be careful. Accusations like that can get a person killed. Accidents happen out here. Guns go off. Horses stumble." "I know about the payroll wagon," Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. "I know about the map. I know you are not protecting this town from the Comanches. You're using the Comanches to rob this town." The silence that stretched between them was thick with violence. Boone's hand twitched near his holster. "You know too much for your own good," he whispered. "You have 24 hours. After that, the law comes, and the law will not be gentle." He turned and signaled his men. As they rode away, Eleanor knew she had just lit the fuse. "We cannot stay here," Tahan said. He had climbed down from the loft as soon as the dust settled. "He knows you know. He will kill you. He will try," Eleanor said, checking the load in her Winchester. "He has the law," Tahan said. "He has the badge. You need more than a gun. You need proof." "Proof is ashes in a burned wagon," Eleanor said bitterly. "It is buried with William." "Not all of it," Tahan said. "My people, we keep things." The warriors who tracked the bandits, they found things. Shell casings. A saddlebag dropped in a raid. "If you come with me to the camp, if you speak to the chief, maybe we can give you the weapon to fight him in his court." "Go to the Comanche camp." Eleanor looked at him. "A week ago, I would have shot you for suggesting it. A week ago, you were blind," Tahan said. "Now you see." It was a terrifying proposition, to ride into the heart of the enemy territory, to leave the only home she had ever known. But looking at the notice Boone had left the legal threat that was just a veil for theft, she realized she had no choice. She had to step out of the white world to save her place in it. They left at dusk, riding 2 of her strongest horses. They took no trails. Tahan guided them through the labyrinth of the Badlands, navigating by the shape of the ridges against the stars. The journey was a baptism by dust and darkness. Eleanor had lived on the frontier for 10 years, but she had always fought against the land, fenced it out, walled it off. Now, she was moving with it. Tahan showed her how to read the wind. "Smell the sage," he whispered as they paused on a rise. "It is stronger here. Water is near, but downwind. Smell the dust wolves." She listened, and she heard it, the faint yip-yip of coyotes, and deeper, the silence that marked the passage of a predator. They rode through a dust storm that turned the world into a choking red twilight. Eleanor tied a bandana over her face, squinting against the grit. Tahan did not falter. He seemed to feel the path through the soles of his horse's hooves. He was part of this harsh, unforgiving world in a way she had never understood. Late in the second day, they stopped at a hidden spring, a small oasis of green in a canyon of red rock. They were exhausted, caked in sweat and grime. "We rest here," Tahan said. "The camp is half a day's ride. We cannot arrive looking like ghosts." Eleanor slid from her saddle, her legs trembling. The water was cool and clear, pooling in a natural stone basin before trickling away into the sand. Tahan watered the horses, then moved downstream to wash. He stripped off his shirt and leggings, unashamed of his body. Eleanor turned away, busying herself with her saddlebags, but the image of his back broad, scarred, moving with fluid grace burned in her mind. She waited until he was done and had moved to sit on a rock, keeping watch. Then she approached the water. "I will turn my back," Tahan said, his voice low. Eleanor stripped down to her chemise and petticoat. The water was a shock, icy and pure. She washed the dust from her face, her neck, her arms. She let her hair down, dipping it into the pool, washing away the miles. The air was heavy with the scent of wet stone and blooming cactus. It was silent, save for the trickle of water and the thudding of her own heart. She felt vulnerable, stripped of her armor of denim and leather. She stood up, wringing out her hair. She turned, expecting Tahan to be looking at the horizon. He was looking at her. He had turned, perhaps at the sound of the water, perhaps because he could not help it. He was 10 feet away. His eyes were wide, dark, and filled with a raw, unguarded wonder. He did not look at her like Boone did, as a prize to be won or a property to be acquired. He looked at her as if she were a spirit that had risen from the water. "You are," he started, then stopped, his English failing him. "You are strong, like the willow. It bends, but it does not break." Eleanor felt a heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. She should have covered herself. She should have been angry, but she wasn't. She walked toward him, the wet fabric of her chemise clinging to her skin. "I am not a willow, Tahan," she said softly. "I am a woman who is tired of bending." She stopped in front of him. He was seated on the rock, so their faces were level. She could see the pulse beating in his throat. She could smell the scent of him, clean water and warm skin. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand, pale and trembling, placed itself over his heart. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud beneath the bronze skin. It was the drumbeat of a life she had been taught to fear, but which now felt like the only truth she knew. Tahan's breath hitched. He covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough, calloused from the bow and the rain, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He leaned forward. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his breath, hot and quick, on her lips. The world seemed to narrow down to the space between them. It would be so easy to close the gap, to let go of the widow, the rancher, the white woman, and just be Eleanor. Her eyes drifted shut. She leaned in. Then she stopped. A voice in her head, the voice of survival. The voice of the world she had to return to whispered a warning. She pulled back, just an inch. Her hand slipped from his chest. "If I cross this line now," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I will not be able to go back, and we have a war to fight." Tahan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He understood. He nodded slowly, releasing her hand. "The war first," he agreed, though his voice was thick with regret. "Then we see where the line is." The tension remained, a charged wire between them. But the moment passed. Eleanor dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons. They did not speak of it, but everything had changed. They were no longer just allies. They were two people holding a breath, waiting for the exhale. The Comanche camp was hidden in a deep, sheltered valley, invisible until they were almost upon it. Dozens of teepees made of buffalo hide stood in a circle, smoke rising from their tops. Children played with dogs. Women scraped hides. Men sharpened weapons. When they rode in, a silence fell over the camp. It was a heavy, hostile silence. Eyes turned to Eleanor, suspicious, angry, curious. She was a trespasser, a symbol of the encroachment that was killing their way of life. Tahan rode with his head high. He spoke in Comanche, his voice ringing out. He gestured to Eleanor, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. An old man emerged from the largest central teepee. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers, but his face was lined with the map of 1,000 sorrows. This was 10 Bears, the chief. Tahan dismounted and signaled Eleanor to do the same. They approached the chief. Tahan spoke at length, pointing to the west, mimicking the sign of the railroad, then pointing to Eleanor. 10 Bears looked at Eleanor. His eyes were like old stones, hard and unyielding. He spoke a few words in English. "You are the woman of the water," he said, "the one who keeps the spring." "I am Eleanor Hart," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I keep the spring for my cattle, but I have never denied water to a thirsty man." "My young men say you saved Tahan," 10 Bears said. "They say you stood against your own people for him." "I stood for the truth," Eleanor said, "and for my land." 10 Bears studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Come, eat." That night, in the smoky warmth of the lodge, Eleanor sat cross-legged on a buffalo robe. She ate stew made of venison and wild turnips. She watched the families around the fire. She saw a mother rocking a baby, singing a lullaby that sounded hauntingly like the ones her own mother had sung. She saw young men boasting of their riding skills, shoving each other playfully. Just like the boys in Red Rock Crossing, she saw the reverence with which they treated the elders. The monster she had constructed in her mind, the faceless, savage Comanche, dissolved. These were people. They loved, they laughed, they feared, and they were dying. She could see the hunger in their faces, the thinness of the children. The buffalo were gone, slaughtered by men like Boone to starve the tribes into submission. Later, Tahan brought a warrior forward. His name was Broken Wing. He unwrapped a piece of buckskin and revealed a handful of brass shell casings. "Found these," Tahan translated, "at the place where the wagon burned, and this—" He held up a heavy brass button. It was stamped with the insignia of the U.S. Cavalry, but it had been sewn onto a piece of rough denim, the kind worn by outlaws, not soldiers. "And this," Broken Wing said, placing a jagged piece of wood on the robe. It was the fletching end of an arrow. But the feathers were not turkey or eagle. They were chicken feathers, dyed red. "Fake," Tahan said. "Made to look like us, but clumsy. No Comanche would use chicken feathers. They do not fly straight." Eleanor picked up one of the shell casings. It was a .50, 70 government round, the same caliber that had killed William. "Boone's men," she whispered. "They dress up as Indians. They raid the wagons. They kill the witnesses. And then Boone blames you for getting the army to clear the land. And to get your water," Tahan added. "The railroad needs water for the steam engines. Hart Creek is the only reliable source for 50 miles. If Boone gets your land, he sells the water rights to the railroad for a fortune." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. William hadn't just been in the wrong place. He had been an obstacle. And for 2 years, Eleanor had been hating the wrong people. She had been guarding her ranch against the wind while the wolf was sitting on her porch. The realization brought a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, clarifying anger. "I need these," Eleanor said, closing her hand over the casings. "I need to take them back." "It is dangerous," 10 Bears said. "The man Boone, he gathers men." "Many guns. A scout came in an hour ago. They are moving. Not to the town. To your ranch." Eleanor's head snapped up. "My ranch. They plan to burn it," Tahan said grimly. "Blame it on us. Say the Comanches attacked the widow, then the army comes. They wipe us out. And Boone takes the land." "We have to go back," Eleanor said, standing up. "Now. We cannot fight an army." Tahan said. "We do not have to fight them all," Eleanor said, her eyes hard. "We just have to expose them, and I will not let him burn my home. That is all I have." 10 Bears looked at her. He saw the fire in her. He nodded to Tahan. "Go," the chief said. "Take 10 warriors, but do not fight unless you must. We want peace, not blood." Tahan stood up. He looked at Eleanor. "We ride." As they mounted their horses in the moonlight, Eleanor felt a strange sensation. She was riding into a battle she could not win alone, flanked by men she had once thought were demons. But looking at Tahan's profile against the stars, she knew she was finally on the right side of the war. The ride back was grueling. They pushed the horses to their limit, but as they crested the final ridge overlooking Hart Creek, Eleanor's heart stopped. Smoke, thick, black smoke was rising from the valley floor. It wasn't the house, not yet. It was the barn. The flames were licking at the night sky, painting the clouds in shades of hellish orange. "They are there," Tahan said, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Boone," Eleanor whispered. She spurred her horse forward, plunging down the slope into the inferno. The rising action was over. The climax had arrived. The town of Red Rock Crossing was a powder keg, and Silas Boone was holding the match. He stood on a crate in front of the gem saloon, his black coat immaculate despite the heat, his voice booming over the gathered crowd of frightened settlers and unemployed cowboys. "They are coming," Boone shouted, gesturing wildly toward the north. "The scouts have seen the smoke signals. The Comanches are gathering. They plan to burn this town to the ground tonight. They want your women. They want your livestock. Are we going to wait for them to cut our throats in our sleep?" "No," the crowd roared back. "I say we strike first," Boone bellowed. "We rode to Hart Creek. That is where they are staging. The widow has turned traitor. She harbors them. She feeds them. She has opened the gate to the wolves. We go there. We secure the water, and we drive the savages back to hell." It was a masterstroke of manipulation. By framing the attack as a preemptive defense, he justified the violence. He had gathered a posse of 30 men, half of them hard cases on his payroll, the other half desperate ranchers who owed the bank money. They mounted up, a dark tide of steel and leather, and rode out of town, leaving a cloud of dust that choked the sunset. Eleanor and Tahan were riding hard from the north, cutting through the canyons to beat the twilight. They smelled the smoke before they saw it. It was not the sweet scent of a campfire. It was the acrid, oily smell of destruction. "The ranch," Eleanor gasped, spurring her horse. They crested the final ridge and looked down. The scene was a nightmare brought to life. The barn was a roaring inferno, the flames leaping 50 feet into the air. The corral fences were smashed, and the cattle were scattered or lying dead in the dust. "Boone," Tahan said, his voice ice cold. "My house," Eleanor cried out. She did not wait for Tahan. Panic, raw and irrational, seized her. She kicked her horse into a gallop, tearing down the slope toward the burning buildings. "Eleanor, wait!" Tahan shouted. But the roar of the fire swallowed his voice. He cursed in Comanche and spurred his mount to follow, but he kept to the shadows of the tree line, his warrior instinct screaming that this was a trap. Eleanor rode straight into the yard. She jumped from her horse before it had fully stopped, her rifle in her hand. "Hank!" she screamed. "Hank!" There was no answer. The heat from the barn was blistering. She ran toward the main house, which was strangely untouched. As she reached the porch, the front door burst open. 3 men rushed out. Before Eleanor could raise her rifle, a lasso whipped through the air, settling over her shoulders and pinning her arms to her sides. She was jerked violently off her feet, landing hard in the dust. Silas Boone stepped out of the shadows of the porch, a cigar glowing in his mouth. "I told you, Eleanor," he said, looking down at her as his men tightened the rope. "I told you I would not ask again." "You are a monster," she spat, struggling against the hemp. "I am a businessman," Boone corrected. "Bring her. We go to the cut. The witnesses are waiting." "What about the Indians?" one of the men asked, looking nervously at the dark hills. "Leave the old man," Boone said, gesturing to a crumpled shape near the water trough. "If the savage comes, he will stop to help him. That will buy us time. Burn the house." As the men dragged Eleanor to a fresh horse, one of them threw a torch through the open window of her living room. Eleanor watched in horror as the curtains caught fire. Everything she owned, every memory of her life with William, was being consumed. They tied her hands to the saddle horn and rode out, heading west toward the jagged scar in the earth known as Dead Man's Cut. Tahan waited until the thunder of hooves had faded before he moved. He slipped into the yard like a ghost, his face painted with ash from the air. The house was burning, but it was too late to save it. He found old Hank by the trough. The ranch hand had been shot in the stomach. He was pale, his life leaking out into the mud. Tahan knelt beside him, lifting the old man's head. "Indian," Hank wheezed, his eyes unfocused. "It is Tahan," the warrior said gently. "Where is she?" "Boone," Hank coughed, blood bubbling on his lips. "Took her. Dead Man's Cut said he has a judge there. Make her sign, or fly." "Dead Man's Cut," Tahan repeated. He knew the place. It was a box canyon with a sheer drop at the end. A place where the wind sounded like screaming. "He killed William," Hank gasped, gripping Tahan's arm with surprising strength. "I heard him, bragging. Said William wouldn't sell, so he had him. Put down." Hank's hand went slack. The old man was gone. Tahan closed Hank's eyes. He stood up, and a terrible sound rose in his throat. Not a war cry, but a vow. He turned to the 10 Comanche warriors who had ridden with him from the camp and were now emerging from the smoke. "They have taken the woman," Tahan said in his own tongue. "They go to the stone trap. We hunt." As they mounted, a single rider appeared from the direction of the town road. Tahan raised his rifle instantly. "Hold fire," the man shouted, raising his hands. It was Deputy Miller. He looked at the burning house, the dead cattle, and the body of old Hank. His face was pale with shock. "Boone told the town you were attacking," Miller said, his voice shaking. "He said you were burning the ranch. I rode ahead to see. God in heaven. He did this himself." "He has the woman," Tahan said, lowering the rifle but not the hammer. "He took her to the cut." Miller looked at Tahan, then at the destruction. The scales had finally fallen from his eyes. He drew his revolver, checked the cylinder, and looked back at Tahan. "I took an oath to uphold the law," Miller said. "What Boone is doing, that is not the law. I am riding with you." Tahan nodded once. "Ride fast, white man, or you will be late for the war." Dead Man's Cut was a place where the earth seemed to have cracked open in agony. High walls of red sandstone rose on 3 sides, ending in a precipice that dropped 600 feet to the rocky riverbed below. Boone's men had set up a lantern on a flat rock near the edge. Beside it sat a terrified man in a suit. A corrupt notary Boone had dragged from bed and 2 of his hired guns, acting as witnesses. Eleanor was shoved onto her knees in front of the rock. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, but her eyes were dry and blazing with hatred. "Sign it," Boone said, thrusting a quill pen at her. "A quitclaim deed, transferring all water and grazing rights to the Boone Cattle Company for the sum of $1. "I will see you in hell first," Eleanor said. "If you do not sign, Boone said, cocking his pistol and pressing the cold metal against her temple. "I will shoot you right here. My witnesses will testify that you were hysterical, distraught over the Indian attack, and threw yourself off the cliff. A tragic suicide." "You are going to kill me anyway," Eleanor said, looking him in the eye. "Perhaps," Boone smiled. "But if you sign, I might make it quick. If you do not, I can let the boys have some fun before you fall." Eleanor shuddered, but she did not look away. "You killed William." "He was a fool," Boone snarled, his patience snapping. "Just like you. He sat on a gold mine of water and wanted to raise cows. I offered him a fair price. He spat at me. So, yes, I had him removed. Business is business." "Eleanor." The confession hit her like a physical blow. All the nights she had spent wondering, all the hatred she had directed at the Comanches, all the guilt she had felt, it all crystallized into a single point of white-hot clarity. The enemy was not the savage in the wild. It was the civilized man in the suit. "You took everything from me," Eleanor whispered. "And I am taking the rest now." Boone said, "Sign." He grabbed her hair, forcing her head down toward the paper. Crack. The sound was not a pistol. It was the sharp, distinctive retort of a Winchester rifle echoing off the canyon walls. The lantern on the rock exploded in a shower of glass and oil. Darkness swooped in, broken only by the moonlight. "Cover!" Boone screamed, dragging Eleanor back toward the cliff edge, using her body as a shield. Chaos erupted. Shadows moved along the canyon rim. Arrows hissed through the air, silent and deadly. One of the hired guns crumpled, a shaft protruding from his chest. "It is the Indians!" someone yelled. "They are everywhere!" Tahan and his warriors were not everywhere, but they were fast, and they had the high ground. They poured fire down into the box canyon. Deputy Miller, positioned at the canyon mouth, cut off the escape route, firing his shotgun into the air to panic the horses. "Kill her!" Boone shouted to his men. "Kill the witch!" A sniper, hidden behind a boulder, raised his rifle, aiming at Eleanor's back as she struggled in Boone's grip. Tahan saw him. He was 50 yards away, scrambling down the scree slope. He did not have a clear shot at the sniper without hitting Eleanor. He did the only thing he could do. He dropped his rifle and sprinted across the open ground. "No!" Eleanor screamed, seeing him break cover. The sniper fired. Tahan jerked mid-stride, his body twisting in the air as the heavy slugs slammed into his side. He hit the ground hard, rolling, blood spraying across the stones, but his distraction worked. The sniper cycled the bolt for a second shot, but he was too slow. Eleanor bit Boone's hand, bit down until she tasted blood. Boone roared and loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. Eleanor dropped to the ground, scrambling for the pistol that had fallen from the holster of the dead guard. Her hand closed around the grip. She rolled onto her back, raised the heavy weapon with 2 hands, and fired. The sniper's head snapped back. He collapsed behind the boulder. Eleanor Hart had never shot a man. She had shot rattlesnakes, coyotes, and injured horses. But as she watched the man fall, she felt no remorse, only a cold, grim satisfaction. "You bitch!" Boone screamed. He was out of ammunition. His men were dead or fleeing. He lunged at her, his face twisted into a mask of pure madness. He grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground, stumbling backward toward the precipice. "If I go, you go!" he shrieked, spit flying into her face. They were on the edge. Eleanor could hear the wind whistling up from the abyss. Her heels dragged in the loose gravel. Boone was strong, his fingers crushing her windpipe. Black spots danced in her vision. She saw Tahan trying to crawl toward them, his hand reaching out, blood trailing behind him. He could not reach her. Nobody could save her. She remembered the last 2 years, the fear, the silence, waiting for a man to come and save her. No more. Eleanor reached up. She did not try to pry his hands away. Instead, she jammed her thumbs deep into his eyes. Boone screamed, a high, wretched sound. He instinctively let go of her throat to claw at his face. Eleanor did not step back. She stepped forward. She placed both hands flat on his chest, gathered every ounce of strength she had left, the strength of the woman who dug post holes, the woman who held the ranch, the woman who survived, and she shoved. "Get off my land," she said. Boone teetered. His arms flailed, grasping at empty air. His heels slipped on the smooth stone. For 1 second, he looked at her with wide, bloody eyes, realizing that the Ice Widow was fired after all. Then he fell. There was a long, terrifying silence, followed by a dull thud far below. Eleanor stood on the edge, her chest heaving, the wind tearing at her torn dress. She was shaking, but she was alive. She turned around. "Tahan!" She ran to him. He was lying on his back, his hand pressed against his side. The blood was dark and flowing fast, pooling beneath him. His face was gray, the warrior's paint streaked with sweat. She fell to her knees, ripping the hem of her petticoat to make a compress. "Stay with me," she ordered, her voice cracking. "Do not you dare leave me." Tahan looked up at her. His eyes were hazy, but they found hers. He smiled, a weak, fleeting thing. "You fought well," he whispered. "Like a Comanche." "Be quiet," she sobbed, pressing down hard on the wound. "Save your strength. Eleanor," he gasped, fighting for breath. "If I go to the spirit land, know this, there is a Comanche who loved you, more than the grass, more than the water." It was the first time he had said the word. Love. It hung in the air, heavier than the smoke, truer than the ground beneath them. "You are not going anywhere," Eleanor said fiercely. "I forbid it. Do you hear me? I forbid it." She looked up. Deputy Miller and the Comanche warriors were gathering around. "Help me," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. "Get the wagon, get the doctor. If he dies, I will burn this territory down myself." "The doctor is in town, ma'am," Miller said gently. "It is a hard ride." "Then we ride hard," Eleanor said. She bent down, putting her lips to Tahan's ear. "You broke me, Tahan. You do not get to leave me in pieces. You stay. You stay, and you fix it." As they lifted him onto a makeshift litter, a drop of water hit Eleanor's cheek, then another, then the sky opened up. It rained. It was not a sprinkle. It was a deluge. Great. Heavy sheets of water fell from the heavens, dousing the fires in the canyon, washing the dust from the air, and mingling with the blood on the rocks. It rained on the burning ruins of the ranch house. It rained on the dead body of Silas Boone at the bottom of the cliff. And it rained on Eleanor Hart as she held Tahan's hand in the back of the wagon, watching his chest rise and fall, praying to a God she had almost forgotten, and to the spirits she was just beginning to know. The drought was over. The war was over. But the long night was just beginning. The rain did not stop for 2 days. It fell with the weight of judgment, turning the dusty streets of Red Rock Crossing into a quagmire of red mud and washing the soot from the ruins of the Hart Ranch. In the back room of the small clinic, the air smelled of ether, carbolic acid, and the metallic tang of blood. Tahan lay on the narrow operating table, his breathing shallow and ragged. The bullet had torn through muscle and chipped a rib, missing the lung by a fraction of an inch, but the loss of blood had been catastrophic. Dr. Reynolds stood by the basin, scrubbing his hands with a fervor that suggested he was trying to wash away more than just grime. He was a balding man with nervous eyes, and he had spent the last hour muttering about protocols and risks. "I have done what I can to stop the bleeding," the doctor said, not looking at Eleanor. "But I cannot guarantee anything. He is strong, yes, but he has lost too much fluid, and fever is setting in." He paused, wiping his hands on a towel. "Mrs. Hart, I must protest again, keeping him here, in the town. It is highly irregular. The mayor is asking questions. People are gathering outside." Eleanor sat in the corner on a wooden stool. She was still wearing the torn, mud-stained dress from Dead Man's Cut. Her face was bruised, her hair a tangled mess, but the Winchester rifle resting across her knees was clean and oiled. "Let them gather," Eleanor said. Her voice was scratchy from the smoke, but it held a terrifying steadiness. "Eleanor, be reasonable," Reynolds pleaded, turning to face her. "He is a Comanche. Even if he saved you, the town is on edge. They see an Indian in my clinic, and they think of scalps. If he dies, they will say it was God's will. If he lives, they might come in here and finish the job. I cannot have that kind of trouble at my door." Eleanor stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She picked up the heavy Colt revolver she had taken from Boone's guard, the gun that had saved her life, and placed it gently on the doctor's desk, right on top of his ledger. "Doctor," she said, "that man on the table took a bullet meant for me. He rode into a box canyon against 30 men because the people of this town were too busy listening to Silas Boone's lies to help me. You are going to treat him. You are going to use your best medicine, your best quinine, and your best bandages." "Or what?" Reynolds scoffed, though his voice trembled. "You will shoot the only physician in the territory." "No," Eleanor said softly. "But I will walk out onto that porch, and I will tell every man, woman, and child that Dr. Reynolds refused to save the hero who stopped Silas Boone. I will tell them you let a man die because of the color of his skin after he bled for your safety. And when the railroad men come, and they are coming, Doctor, I will tell them that this town is not civilized enough for a station." Reynolds stared at her. He saw the cold fire in her blue eyes, the absolute absence of fear. He realized that the Ice Widow had not melted. She had been forged into steel. He swallowed hard, picked up the bottle of laudanum, and turned back to the patient. "I will need more hot water," he muttered. "And clean linens. Go ask the deputy." The truth about Silas Boone broke over the town like a dam collapse. Deputy Miller, emboldened by the adrenaline of the fight and the shame of his own blindness, had ridden straight to Boone's private office at the back of the bank. He had kicked the door in and cracked the safe. What he found was not just money, but a meticulous record of damnation. There were maps marking the locations of the Comanche raids that aligned perfectly with land Boone wanted to buy. There were letters from the leader of the bandit gang, demanding payment for acting services involving feathers and paint. And there was the deed to Hart Creek, drafted and ready. Dated 3 days prior to the attack. Miller nailed the documents to the wall of the sheriff's office. The town split down the middle. For the ranchers who had lost cattle or family to real raids in the past, accepting that a white man had orchestrated the recent terror was a bitter pill. They grumbled in the saloon, nursing their pride along with their whiskey, claiming that an Indian is still an Indian. But for others, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the wives who had lived in terror of an invisible enemy, the revelation brought a wave of guilt. They remembered how they had shunned Eleanor. They remembered how they had cheered when Boone called for a lynching. 3 days later, a private train car arrived at the makeshift siding south of town. 2 men in expensive gray suits disembarked. They were representatives of the Great Western Railroad. They did not care about morality. They cared about schedules and public relations. They met Eleanor in the parlor of the small hotel where she was staying while Tahan recovered. She sat upright, wearing a borrowed black dress that was too big for her, looking every inch the formidable matriarch. "Mrs. Hart," the senior representative said, smoothing his mustache, "this business with Mr. Boone is regrettable, a tragedy. The railroad had no knowledge of his methods." "Mr. Boone claimed he was acting on your behalf," Eleanor said calmly. "He said the railroad needed the water." "We need water, yes," the man said hastily. "But we purchased it. We do not steal it. We certainly do not condone murder." He looked at the deputy standing by the door. "We want this settled quietly. The papers in the East love a story about an Indian war. They would love a story about a railroad tycoon hiring bandits even more. That kind of story drops stock prices." "What are you proposing?" Eleanor asked. "We will finance the rebuilding of your ranch," the man said. "Double the lumber, double the stock. We will build a proper station here, which will raise property values. In exchange, you grant us a water easement at Hart Creek, paid annually at a premium rate, and you sign a statement saying that the conflict was a local dispute with a rogue agent. not a systemic issue. Eleanor looked at the contract they slid across the table. It was enough money to secure her future for a lifetime. It was independence. One more condition, she said. Name it. You will build a school, she said, and it will be open to all children, from the town, from the ranches, and from the reservation. The railroad men exchanged a look. Mrs. Hart, that is unconventional. So is shooting a man off a cliff, Eleanor said. Do we have a deal? The senior representative sighed and pulled a fountain pen from his pocket. We have a deal. The following week, the sun returned, baking the mud into hard clay. With the sun came 10 bears. The Comanche chief did not sneak in. He rode down Main Street with 20 warriors behind him. They were not painted for war, but they carried their weapons openly. The townspeople watched from behind curtains and storefronts, holding their breath. Eleanor met them on the porch of the Gem Saloon. Beside her stood Deputy Miller and the new mayor. 10 bears dismounted. He looked older than the mountains, his face a landscape of deep lines. He walked up the steps and stood before Eleanor. My son lives. 10 bears said. It was not a question. He lives, Eleanor replied. The fever broke last night. He is weak, but his spirit is strong. 10 bears nodded. He turned to face the town. He spoke in Comanche, and one of the younger warriors translated in loud, clear English. For many moons, blood has flowed between us, the warrior shouted. Lies were told. Men died from rocks and grass. But the woman Hart and the warrior Tahan have shown us a different path. 10 bears stepped forward. We will not hunt your cattle, he said, his voice gravelly. We will not burn your fences, but the Iron Horse must stay on its path. The high canyons to the north, where the spirits of our ancestors sleep. No white man goes there, no surveyor, no hunter. If you cross that line, the truce ends. The mayor, a nervous man who owned the feed store, stepped forward. We agree, he stammered. We have no quarrel with you, Chief. Boone is dead. We just want peace. 10 bears looked at Eleanor. A flicker of respect passed between them. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small leather pouch. He handed it to her. Medicine, he said, for the wound that does not bleed. He meant her heart. Eleanor took the pouch, feeling the weight of the gesture. It was a recognition. She was no longer just a white woman occupying land. She was an ally. But peace with the Comanche was easier to sign than peace with society. That Sunday, as Eleanor was leaving the general store with fresh supplies for the clinic, she was cornered by Mrs. Higgins and Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed guardians of Red Rock Crossing's morality. Eleanor, dear, Mrs. Higgins began, clutching her shawl tight. We are all so relieved you are safe. Truly, it was a miracle. Thank you, Martha, Eleanor said, trying to step around them. However, Mrs. Gable interjected, stepping into her path. There is talk about the arrangement. What arrangement? Eleanor asked, her grip tightening on the basket. The Indian boy? Mrs. Higgins whispered, as if the word were obscene. He is still in the clinic. We hear you sit with him at night, alone. He is recovering from a gunshot wound he took to save my life, Eleanor said. We understand that, Mrs. Gable said with a tight, pained smile. And gratitude is a Christian virtue. But there are limits. Eleanor, it is not proper for a widow. Think of the children. What will they think seeing a white woman so familiar with a savage? It sets a confusing example. Eleanor looked at the two women. 2 years ago, their judgment would have crushed her. 2 years ago, she would have retreated to her ranch and frozen her heart just to avoid their whispers. She laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that made Mrs. Higgins jump. You speak of propriety, Eleanor asked. Where was your propriety when Silas Boone was starving my cattle? Where was your Christian virtue when the town was ready to hang an innocent man in the street? We were deceived, Mrs. Higgins protested. You were comfortable, Eleanor corrected. And now you are uncomfortable because I do not fit in your box. Well, ladies, I have news for you. I burned the box." She stepped past them, her head high. "And tell the Reverend I will not be at the service this Sunday. I have a patient to tend to." The clinic was quiet that night. The oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow against the white walls. Tahan was propped up on pillows. He was thin, his cheekbones sharp against his skin, but his eyes were clear. Eleanor sat in the chair beside the bed, peeling an apple with a small knife. "They talk about you," Tahan said. His voice was raspy, but the strength was returning to it. "The women in the street. I hear them through the window." "Let them talk," Eleanor said, slicing a piece of fruit. "They have nothing else to do." Tahan watched her hands. "They say you ruin yourself. They say you choose a dog over your own kind." Eleanor stopped. She looked at him. "Is that what you think you are?" "It is what I am to them." Tahan said, "I am a Comanche. I can ride with you. I can fight for you. But I cannot sit at their table." He turned his head away, looking at the dark window. "If I stay, Eleanor, you become an island. No friends, no respect. Just the crazy widow and her Indian." "I have been on an island for 2 years," Eleanor said. "It was lonely and cold. And if you send me away," Tahan asked, "you could marry a shopkeeper or a rancher, be safe, be accepted." Eleanor put the knife down. She reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had initiated the touch since the night by the spring. "I lived my whole life doing what I was told," she said softly. "I married William because my father said he was a good match. I ran the ranch because society said a widow must honor her husband's legacy. I refused every man who came courting because I was afraid of making a mistake. I spent 30 years trying to be what everyone else wanted." She squeezed his hand. "And where did it get me? It got me a dead husband and a gun to my head. It got me a town that watched me burn. I am done with that. Tahan, I do not care about their respect. I care about the man who looked at me and saw me. Not the land, not the water. Me!" Tahan turned back to her. His eyes were wet. "Two worlds," he whispered. "I am not white. You are not Comanche. We live in the space between. It is a hard place to live. The wind blows from both sides." "Then we build a shelter," Eleanor said. "We build it strong, and we let the wind blow." The thaw began slowly, like the first trickle of water in a frozen creek. It started with a basket of eggs left on the hotel doorstep the next morning. There was no note, but Eleanor recognized the weaving. It was from the Miller family, the ones who had fled early in the trouble and had just returned. Then, Deputy Miller came to the clinic. He stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand. "Tahan," Miller said, nodding to the man in the bed. "The mayor and I, we have been talking. With the railroad coming, and the new treaty, we need someone who speaks both tongues, someone who knows the land." Tahan looked at him warily. "You want a scout? We want a liaison," Miller said. "An official position, paid by the county, $20 a month. We need someone to make sure we do not make mistakes again, to keep the peace." It was an olive branch. It was practical. Yes, the town needed Tahan's skills, but it was also an admission that he had a place there. Tahan looked at Eleanor. She gave a small, barely perceptible nod. "I will not wear a badge." Tahan said, "No badge." Miller agreed. "Just a voice." "Then I will do it." Tahan said, "For the land, not for the town." "Fair enough," Miller said. He put his hat back on. "And Mrs. Hart." The lumber arrived at the barn. "A dozen men from the valley are heading out there tomorrow to start raising the frame," they said. "Well, they said they owe you a day's work." A week later, Eleanor rode out to Hart Creek alone. The charred remains of the barn had been cleared away. The skeleton of a new, larger structure was rising against the sky. The grass, fed by the heavy rains, was turning a vibrant, impossible green. She walked to the edge of the creek, to the spot where she had first seen the silhouette on the ridge. She remembered the feeling of that day, the cold, hard knot in her stomach, the certainty that she was alone against the world. She remembered the ice widow. She looked down at her reflection in the water. The face staring back was older. There were new lines around the eyes, and a small scar on her cheek from the fight at the cut. But the eyes were different. The ice was gone. She thought about the phrase the town used. Broke her. They said the Indian broke her. Eleanor smiled, and it was a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. They were wrong. He hadn't broken her. He had broken the cage. He had shattered the glass box she had built around herself to keep from feeling the pain of living. She wasn't broken. She was open. The evening sun was casting long, golden shadows across the porch of the temporary cabin when Tahan finally walked out. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane Deputy Miller had carved for him, but he was upright. Eleanor was sitting on the steps, mending a shirt. She looked up as he opened the door. He sat down beside her, groaning slightly as he adjusted his leg. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the twilight settle over the Llano Verde. In the yard, near the new corral, a group of children were playing. They were the two sons of the carpenter who was rebuilding the house, their hair blonde and unruly. And playing with them were two Comanche boys, nephews of 10 bears who had come with the work crew to trade horses. They were playing a game of tag, running and shrieking, their languages mixing into a chaotic, joyous noise. There was no fear. There was no history. Just children running on the grass. Tahan pointed at them with his chin. "Look," he said softly. "The future." "It is messy," Eleanor observed, watching one of the white boys trip and get hauled up by a Comanche boy. "Life is messy," Tahan said. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. "But it is better than being clean and dead." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder. The rough wool of his blanket scratched her cheek, and the scent of him, sage and smoke, filled her lungs. "Yes," she whispered, watching the first star appear above the ridge. "It is." The falling action had settled into a steady, quiet rhythm. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by the hard, rewarding work of rebuilding. They were two outcasts who had found a center, sitting on a porch between the wilderness and the town, watching a new world try to be born. 9 months passed, and the Llano Verde changed not with a whisper, but with the roar of a steam engine. Where once there had been only the silent, dusty track leading to the Hart Ranch, there was now a town. It did not sprawl like Red Rock Crossing had. It clustered tightly around the new lifeblood of the territory, the depot. They called the place Twin Springs, named for the second source of water Tahan had found deep in the limestone canyon, a source that now fed the massive water tower standing like a sentinel beside the iron rails. The old town of Red Rock Crossing was slowly dying, its buildings dismantled plank by plank and carted south to be reborn here. The saloon was new, smelling of pine sawdust rather than stale beer. The church was small but whitewashed, its bell ringing out clear and bright on Sunday mornings. And in the center of it all stood the Hart Creek Station, a bustling hub where the east met the west. Eleanor Hart stood on the platform, checking the manifest on her clipboard. She wore a dress of deep blue calico, practical but vibrant, a stark contrast to the morning blacks and grays she had worn for 2 years. Her hair was pulled back, but strands of it escaped to frame a face that had lost its gaunt hardness. The sun had browned her skin, and the wind had etched lines around her eyes, but they were lines of laughter, not bitterness. "Miguel," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise of the loading dock. "Those crates go to the dry goods store. Be careful with the crate marked fragile. It is glass for the schoolhouse windows. Si, patrona!" A young Mexican man shouted back, hoisting the box with a grin. Beside him, a Comanche youth named Swift Fox was checking the cinches on a pack mule. The two young men exchanged a joke in a pidgin mix of Spanish and English, laughing as they worked. Eleanor watched them, a small smile touching her lips. 9 months ago, the idea of a Mexican and a Comanche working side by side on a white woman's ranch would have started a riot. Now, it was just Tuesday. She had hired them all. When the ranch expanded to supply beef to the railroad crews, she needed hands. She hired the drifting cowboys who had been duped by Boone. She hired the Mexican vaqueros who knew how to handle the longhorn cattle better than anyone. And, defying every social convention in the territory, she hired young men from the reservation who wanted to learn the trade of the new world without forgetting the spirit of the old. She was still the boss. She could still strip a Winchester in under a minute and drop a coyote at 200 yards. But the Ice Widow was gone. In her place was something stronger, a woman who had melted the ice to water the roots of a community. A whistle blew in the distance, a long, lonely sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The 3:15 from Santa Fe was on time, as the great black locomotive chugged into view, spewing white steam against the azure sky. A rider emerged from the dust alongside the tracks. He rode a paint horse, sitting easily in the saddle, wearing a vest of buckskin over a store-bought shirt. It was Tahan. He raised a hand in greeting to the engineer, who waved back enthusiastically. Tahan was no longer the shadow on the ridge. He was the scout for the Great Western Line. He was the man who rode ahead of the trains to ensure the tracks were clear of rock slides and buffalo herds. He was the man who negotiated passage with the bands of renegades who still roamed the high country, using words instead of bullets. He rode up to the platform as the train hissed to a halt. He dismounted, his movement fluid despite the slight stiffness in his side, a permanent reminder of the bullet he had taken at Dead Man's Cut. Eleanor walked down the steps to meet him. She did not care who was watching. She did not care about the passengers staring from the windows, whispering about the white woman and the Indian. "The pass is clear," Tahan said, his voice low and intimate amidst the chaos. "Ten Bear sends his word. The hunting party will stay north of the ridge." "Good," Eleanor said. She reached out and brushed a smudge of soot from his cheek. "You look tired." "It was a long ride," Tahan admitted, "but the wind was good." "Go home," she ordered gently. "Supper is in the oven. I have 2 more manifests to sign, and then I will be right behind you." "Home." Tahan repeated the word, tasting it. It was still a strange concept for a man who had spent his life following the buffalo, but looking at the woman before him, he knew that home was not a place. It was a person. The wedding had happened 3 months earlier, in the late spring when the wildflowers painted the prairie in riots of yellow and purple. It had not been in the church. Eleanor had insisted on that. They stood on the bank of Hart Creek, under the great cottonwood tree that had sheltered Tahan when he was wounded. The Reverend Thomas, a young man who had come west with more faith than prejudice, stood on one side. Chief Ten Bears, his headdress majestic in the sunlight, stood on the other. The guests were a mosaic of the frontier. Deputy Miller stood beside Broken Wing. The schoolteacher stood next to Miguel. There were skeptics. Of course, there were people who stood at the back, arms crossed, waiting for lightning to strike. But there were more people who stood in the front, witnessing the union of the 2 forces that had saved their town. Eleanor wore a dress of cream-colored lace, an heirloom from her mother that she had altered to fit her leaner frame. Tahan wore his finest buckskins, embroidered with beads in the pattern of the morning star. The Reverend read from the Bible about love being patient and kind. Then, Ten Bears stepped forward. He took a strip of soft leather and bound Eleanor's left wrist to Tahan's right. "2 paths," the old chief rumbled. "1 river. The water flows together. It cannot be separated again." When Tahan kissed her, a cheer went up that startled the birds from the trees. It was not a polite, civilized applause. It was a raucous, joyous noise, yips from the Comanche warriors, whistles from the cowboys, and applause from the settlers. It was the sound of a wall coming down. Now, sitting on the porch of the expanded ranch house as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Eleanor watched the twilight settle over her kingdom. The house was larger now, with a new wing added for the workers and a proper parlor where she met with cattle buyers. But her favorite spot was still the old rocking chair facing the creek. A buggy was coming up the drive. Eleanor squinted. It was not a local buckboard. It was a polished city carriage, looking out of place in the dust. Tahan stepped out of the house, drying his hands on a towel. He saw the carriage and moved to stand beside Eleanor's chair. He did not reach for a weapon. Those days were mostly over, but his posture shifted, becoming alert and watchful. The carriage stopped, and 3 men stepped out. They were dressed in suits that cost more than a year's wages for a cowboy. The leader was a man with a thick mustache and eyes that assessed the value of everything they touched. "Mrs. Hart," the man asked, removing his hat. "I am Cornelius Vanderbilt's agent from Chicago. My name is Sterling." "Mr. Sterling," Eleanor said, not rising. "You are a long way from Chicago." "We are looking for opportunities," Sterling said, sweeping his hand across the vista. "This location, Twin Springs. It is strategic. We have plans, big plans, a spur line to the silver mines in the south, a processing plant for the beef, a city, Mrs. Hart, a real city. Not this outpost." He smiled, a smile that reminded Eleanor faintly of Silas Boone. Though without the underlying menace of violence, this was the menace of progress. "We want to buy you out," Sterling said. "The water rights, the land, all of it. We are prepared to offer you $50,000. Cash. $50,000. It was a fortune. It was enough to move to New York, to Paris, to live in a mansion with servants and silk sheets. It was enough to erase every hardship she had ever endured." Eleanor looked at Tahan. He was watching the men, his face impassive. He knew what $50,000 meant. He knew it could buy safety. It could buy insulation from the world that still looked at him sideways. Eleanor looked past the men to the creek. She saw the willows swaying in the wind. She saw the grave of old Hank on the hill, marked with a white stone. She saw the tracks of the Mustang herd Tahan protected. She looked back at Sterling. "You want to build a city," she said. "A metropolis." Sterling corrected. "Factories, smelters, jobs." "And the water?" she asked. "We would dam the creek upstream." Sterling explained enthusiastically. "Create a reservoir, maximize efficiency." "Dam the creek," Eleanor repeated. "And what happens to the ranchers downstream? What happens to the reservation land that relies on the overflow?" Sterling shrugged. "Progress requires sacrifice. Mrs. Hart, the greater good." Eleanor smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had stared down a lynch mob and pushed a murderer off a cliff. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, "in this house, we have a different definition of the greater good, and we have a law of our own. No one here gets rich on the blood of others, or their thirst." Sterling blinked, his smile faltering. "Mrs. Hart, be reasonable. $50,000. "My husband died for this land," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "My friend died from it. I killed it. Do you think paper money has any weight against that?" She stood up then, and Tahan stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They stood together, a united front of denim and buckskin. "This land is not for sale," Eleanor said. "Not the water, not the grass. We are building a community here, Mr. Sterling, not a factory. We are growing families, not profits." "You are making a mistake," Sterling said, his tone cooling. "The railroad will expand with or without you. Then let it expand around us," Tahan said. His voice was deep, carrying the authority of the earth itself. "Like the river flows around the rock stays." Sterling looked at them, the white woman and the Comanche warrior, standing on the porch of a house built from the ashes of conflict. He saw something there that his ledger books could not account for. He saw a root system too deep to tear up. He put his hat back on. "Good day, Mrs. Hart." They watched the carriage turn and head back toward the town. The dust settled, leaving the air clear and sweet. $50,000, Tahan mused. "That is a lot of ponies." "We have enough ponies," Eleanor said, sitting back down. "And we have enough trouble without building a city." Later, after the moon had risen, they walked down to the creek. The air was cool, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Down by the water, 2 figures were playing in the silver light. One was a little girl, perhaps 5 years old, with hair the color of corn silk. She was the daughter of a cousin of Eleanor's from the east. orphaned by fever and sent west because there was nowhere else to go. The other was a boy, slightly older, with skin like copper and hair like a raven's wing. He was Broken Wing's son, whose mother had died in the winter. 10 bears had brought the boy to Eleanor and Tahan a month ago. "He needs a mother," the chief had said, "and you have room in your heart." Now, the 2 children were chasing fireflies. They ran along the bank, laughing, their small hands reaching for the flickering lights. They did not care that they were different. They did not care about the history of their blood. They only knew that the grass was soft and the stars were bright. "Dos mundos," Tahan whispered. "2 worlds." "1 world," Eleanor corrected. "Theirs." They walked up the small rise overlooking the tracks. In the distance, the lights of the Twin Springs depot twinkled. Farther out, the campfire of a cattle drive burned like a lonely beacon. Tahan wrapped his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, pulling her close against his side. She leaned into him, fitting perfectly against the curve of his body. The old fear, the old coldness, was a memory so distant it felt like it belonged to a stranger. "Do you ever wonder," Eleanor asked, looking at the endless horizon, "do you wonder what they will say about us?" In 10 years at 20, Tahan looked at her. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his touch rough and tender. "They will tell stories," Tahan said. "Some will say you were a witch who bewitched a savage. Some will say I was a traitor who sold his soul for a white woman. Men like to put things in boxes. It makes them feel safe." "And what is the truth?" Eleanor asked. Tahan smiled. He looked at the land. Then he looked at the woman who was more vast and mysterious to him than the plains had ever been. "They can tell whatever story they want," Tahan said softly. "We know we lived right. We stood when others ran. We loved when others hated. That is enough." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of the wind, of the rain that had saved them, and of the promise of tomorrow. Above them, the vast western sky stretched out to infinity, indifferent to the struggles of ants and men. But down here, on this small patch of earth, a widow and a warrior had carved out a peace that defied the world. The Ice Widow was gone. Savage was gone. There was only Eleanor and Tahan, standing together in the starlight, ready to face whatever the morning train might bring. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Eleanor and Tahan as much as I enjoyed writing it. It is a story about the walls we build and the courage it takes to tear them down. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. Are you in the city, the country, or maybe somewhere halfway across the world? Let's share our thoughts and connect. If you like this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to me and helps me keep bringing these legends of the frontier to life. Stay safe and keep riding toward your own horizon.